So there's some pretty big changes coming to Legion Remix, including some pretty big nerfs for open world content when it specifically comes to farming infinite power, but a pretty big buff coming to everything but tanks, which I think will actually have a much bigger impact on how the majority of the player base is actually playing Legion Remix. Now, the biggest change with this is a pretty heavy nerf to certain content in the open world. Now, in my previous video, we went over that they had already nerfed elite farming in the open world when it specifically comes to infinite power farming. And then we also got this post after that point where they said they are going to be nerfing elite farming in the open world and mining and herb gathering because they were way overperforming a lot of the other aspects of the game when it comes to infinite power farming. Now, I'm not sure if this was an additional nerf to elite enemies or if this was just calling out the nerf they had already done and that they are also nerfing mining and herb gathering, because we also have a hotfix past this that also does more balancing to mining and herbing. Now, when it specifically comes to gathering, a lot of people were kind of confused on this because most people really hadn't been doing this unless they had like a daily quest for it. But if you had a very high infinite knowledge and you just flew around and got all the mines and herbs you could find, it was actually really good infinite power because you were essentially guaranteed a good amount of threads, and because all of those threads would be massively buffed up by your infinite knowledge, really high infinite knowledge just made them absolutely ridiculous. I was honestly surprised how crazy it got at like maxed out infinite power for phase 1. So they've pretty heavily nerfed the infinite power you can get from elite enemies in the open world and gathering. I will say that the elite enemy thing was just way too strong in general. Like I mentioned before, people were already at like 400 ranks of limits unbound, which is absolutely ridiculous. I don't think they really needed to nerf the mining and gathering. They probably wanted to do that so after they nerfed elites, everybody wasn't just like forced or heavily incentivized to go do that, because that would definitely get really boring to a lot more people. And then also in another hotfix on the 14th, they also did some additional balance changes to gathering. So gathering nodes in Legion Remix have had their loot tables normalized. I'm assuming this is just to normalize every loot table at a baseline, so every gatherable is kind of the same. But then rich gathering nodes have a chance to contain mementos, and seam gathering nodes now have a high chance to contain multiple mementos. So they are essentially just normalizing all the loot tables of all gathering, and it is still going to be nerfed from previously. But then the rich and seam gathering nodes just have a chance, or more specifically with seams, are just going to be much more juiced. So I think that requires some testing to see if gathering is still going to be really worthwhile to do, specifically when it comes to like end game infinite power farming. But the really big change is a massive nerf to all of these super high-end players that were farming for hours and hours with these elite farms. And that is that characters with over 10 million infinite power have had their infinite power reduced to 10 million. Now, a lot of people were kind of complaining about this. Most people don't even have 10 million. It's only really the people that were doing those farms or playing ungodly amounts of Legion Remix. Keep in mind, 10 million infinite power is still like 195 ranks of limits unbound. That's still 195% versatility. You're still absolutely able to probably go solo everything. You could probably still solo mythic raid bosses with a character that geared with that much infinite power. So while this was probably a pretty big nerf to some very small amount of people, I think in general it's good just to bring everybody back a little bit more in line. Even though 10 million is still kind of crazy, you're still absurdly strong. But I think it's to not have people be so absurdly over the top at this point that it just feels like everything is trivial. And there is also an issue with a lot of people getting way too strong way too quickly, and that everybody else that hasn't spent like 12 hours a day playing Legion Remix have a much harder time getting in groups, and just also have a lot less people to play with, because the more and more people that are super geared, the more they're not going to be doing any lower difficulty stuff, especially Mythic Plus keys, meaning it's harder to find groups, meaning it's much harder for people to actually gear up, meaning those people just stay super geared and the lower geared people just have an increasingly hard time to do any of the actual content. But we're also going to be getting a massive buff to specifically damage dealing and healing specializations on the upcoming Tuesday, which is also the release of Phase 2. And they specifically talk about this because they know tank meta is very highly used and just the absolute meta in High Mythic Plus right now. Like every raid I join is just half filled with tanks, even though I think in raids it actually is better to be DPS and just have the normal amount of tanks, because DPS are still doing more damage than tanks. Just in something like Mythic Plus, Plus, if you don't have to worry about a healer, you can bring in all tanks, do crazy AoE burst damage with the artifact abilities, have everybody be tanks so they can all keep themselves alive, and you're still doing really good damage anyway. So it's just much better to do it in that way, especially since all keys below a certain point, you're essentially just grouping everything up and using your artifact abilities to just kill it all anyway. There's not really a reason to have a DPS or a healer over a tank in that situation. So DPS and healers are hopefully getting pretty massive buffs to this point, because also, even though I said DPS are actually better than tanks in terms of pure DPS, and that is true, they are, but the difference between those two isn't that high actually. So while in raid you would still want DPS because you're not having to keep yourself alive like you would in a Myth Plus run, and in a raid you could have 1 or 2 healers and it's not that big of a deal, but it's still a pretty big problem. The damage aren't doing like a crazy amount more damage than tanks that are equivalent gear or equivalent progression. I am very curious on what they're going to be doing to healers, because if they're not rebalancing any other content throughout the game, they're just buffing damage dealers and healers, I'm assuming they're gonna have to buff healers damage, because the only other thing I could think of is like trying to buff up healers healing and just give them crazy amounts of healing that anytime someone takes like a tick of damage, they're pretty much instantly healed, which they kind of already are with how much leech you have. So I assume they're just going to be buffing up the damage of healers as well, which I'm not sure if that will be super strong for bringing healers, but I assume at some point when we get to like crazy high Mythic Plus keys that you'll probably want a normal group with a healer, and healers being able to have much higher damage will allow that to actually happen. So that's pretty much all the news we have for Legion Remix. Now, if you're kind of confused on what you should really be doing to be efficiently farming gear or infinite power, I would say that it's the most obvious stuff now. It's kind of similar to just normal retail. You're going to be doing your daily quests, which I would generally recommend you pick up as either dungeon or raid dailies. Then you're going to be doing your daily heroic and normal dungeon. Then you're going to be doing your daily raids, whether that also extends to doing like your daily LFR raids or doing all the different difficulties. That's really up to you how much you actually want to do, but I definitely recommend doing at least like heroic or mythic raids every day, especially if you're looking to get all of the cosmetics. I definitely recommend doing mythic because you'll be getting those currency items that allow you to buy the really rare boss drop items like Xavius' shoulders, or in the coming phases, those other super rare weapons everybody's going to want. So if you really want to be as optimal as possible, do those daily quests, do your daily 2 dungeons, and then do your daily raids on Mythic, and then you're pretty much done. And if you want to put in more time after that, Mythic Plus is probably just going to be your best bet for everything past that point, because like I mentioned in one of my recent videos, they buffed up Mythic Plus, so now you'll just be getting a good chunk of infinite power through the item that you get 100 of and turn it into infinite power, and then a ton of gear through the tokens you're also getting from Mythic Plus that they massively buffed. So you're getting a good amount of infinite power, a good amount of gear progression, both from Mythic Plus after you do your dailies, which I think for the time invested is still going to probably be the best things to be doing. After that, Mythic Plus is a close second, and I don't think anything is really close after that point. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.